David had always known that old bridge was special, not because it was pretty or fancy, but because his grandfather had built it with his own two hands back in 1978. The man had been a steel worker his whole life, and when he bought that little piece of land on the edge of town, he decided the property needed a proper bridge to connect it to the main road, so he built one. Took him nearly 6 months working weekends and evenings, but he got it done. When Grandpa Joe passed away, he left that land and bridge to David. It wasn't much, just a few acres and that aging steel structure crossing over a deep ravine, but it meant everything to him. It was a piece of his grandfather's legacy, a reminder of the man who'd taught him about hard work and taking care of your own property. The bridge itself wasn't winning any beauty contests. The steel beams had rust spots here and there. The wooden planks creaked when you drove over them, and honestly, it looked like something from another era. But it was solid. It did its job. And for 15 years, David made sure to keep it maintained, painting the beams every few years, replacing worn boards, checking the structure after bad storms. Here's the thing, though. That bridge didn't just serve David's property. When the developers came in during the early 2000s and built Meadowbrook Estates, they created this beautiful neighborhood of 30 large homes right behind David's land. These weren't small houses either. We're talking about $500,000 homes with 3-car garages, swimming pools, and perfectly manicured lawns. The kind of place where everyone drives luxury cars and hires landscaping services. The only practical way to reach Meadowbrook from the main highway was across David's bridge. Sure, there was technically another route, but it involved going 40 miles around the mountain on narrow, winding roads that were barely maintained. Nobody wanted to use that route, so everyone in Meadowbrook used David's bridge. Every single day. Every single car. David never asked for anything in return. He never set up a toll booth or demanded payment. He figured he was being a good neighbor, just like his grandfather would have wanted. The bridge was already there, and it wasn't hurting anyone to let people use it. Besides, these were his neighbors, right? That's what neighbors do. They help each other out. But here's where things started to get uncomfortable. About 5 years into living there, David lost his job at the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for over a decade. The company downsized, and he was one of the unlucky ones who got let go. Money got tight. Really tight. He picked up some freelance work here and there, but it wasn't the same as having a steady paycheck. The bridge maintenance started to slip. David did what he could, but professional repairs cost money he didn't have. He needed to replace some of the support cables, and a few of the wooden planks were getting soft. Nothing dangerous yet, but definitely things that needed attention before they became problems. So David did what seemed reasonable. He went to a Meadowbrook Homeowners Association meeting and asked if they might be willing to chip in for some of the repairs. He wasn't asking them to pay for everything, just maybe help out since they used the bridge every single day. He even brought estimates from contractors showing what the work would cost. The president of the HOA, a guy named Robert who drove a Mercedes and always wore expensive suits, barely looked at the papers. He smiled in that polite way people do when they're about to say no, and explained that the bridge was David's property, and therefore David's responsibility. The HOA had no obligation to maintain someone else's private property. Several other residents nodded in agreement. One woman even suggested that if David couldn't afford to maintain the bridge, maybe he should consider selling his land. David left that meeting feeling pretty small. He'd just asked for some help, neighbor to neighbor, and got treated like he was asking for a handout. But what could he do? They were technically right. It was his bridge on his property. Over the next few years, David managed to scrape together enough money to do the most essential repairs. The bridge stayed functional, but it was getting more worn down. The residents of Meadowbrook started complaining. Not to David directly, mind you, but to each other and at HOA meetings. They didn't like the way the bridge looked. They didn't like how it creaked. They worried it made their neighborhood look less prestigious. Robert, the HOA president, sent David a couple of letters. Very official-looking letters on HOA letterhead. They stated that the bridge was becoming a public safety concern and an eyesore that was affecting their property values. They demanded that David either fix it up to their standards or do something about it. The letters had this threatening tone, like they were doing him a favor by even notifying him of their displeasure. David tried to explain his situation. He'd love to fix up the bridge properly, but he was barely keeping his head above water financially. He'd recently had some medical bills that wiped out what little savings he had. He was doing the best he could. If they wanted the bridge to look nicer, maybe they could reconsider helping with the costs. The answer was always the same. Not their problem. Not their property. Not their responsibility. Then came that Tuesday morning that changed everything. David was at home, trying to fix a leaky faucet in his kitchen, when he heard the heavy rumble of machinery. At first he thought maybe the county was doing some road work on the highway, but the sound was too close. It was coming from his property. He rushed outside and couldn't believe what he was seeing. There were two massive excavators on his land right next to the bridge. A crew of workers in hard hats and safety vests were moving around, setting up equipment. And there, standing off to the side with his arms crossed and a satisfied look on his face, was Robert from the HOA. David ran down to the bridge, his heart pounding. "What's going on here? What are you doing?" Robert turned to him with barely concealed annoyance. "We're taking care of the safety hazard. The bridge is being demolished." "Demolished? This is my property. You can't just come onto my land and tear down my bridge." One of the construction workers walked over, looking uncomfortable. He had a clipboard with some official-looking papers. "Sir, we have the proper permits. This structure has been declared unsafe and is being removed for public safety." David felt like the ground was dropping out from under him. "Permits? Who issued permits for my private property?" Robert stepped forward. "The county issued the permits after we filed the necessary complaints about the unsafe structure. This bridge is a danger to everyone who uses it, and frankly, it's bringing down our property values. We tried to work with you, but you refused to take appropriate action. Work with me? You refused to help with repairs. And this is my bridge. My grandfather built this." Robert's expression didn't change. He spoke in that calm, condescending tone that made David's blood boil. "If you have a legal issue with this, you're welcome to file a complaint with the county. But the permits are valid and this work is proceeding. I suggest you step back to a safe distance." David wanted to argue more, to physically stop them, but what could he do? The machinery was already moving. The workers were professional, just doing their job. And Robert stood there like he owned the place, watching with satisfaction. By noon, the bridge was gone. Completely demolished. The steel beams had been cut apart and hauled away. The wooden planks were piled up like trash. The supports that David's grandfather had set in concrete almost 50 years ago were jackhammered out and pushed into the ravine below. David stood at the edge of his property, staring at the empty space where the bridge used to be, and felt something hard settle in his chest. They'd made a mistake. A big one. And they were about to find out just how big. The next morning, David was up before sunrise. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that bridge being torn apart piece by piece. But he wasn't going to just sit there and let them get away with what they'd done. He had a plan. He drove straight to the county clerk's office when it opened at 8. The clerk, an older woman named Betty who'd worked there for probably 30 years, greeted him with a friendly smile. "Morning, David. What can I help you with today?" "I need copies of my property deeds, the original survey from 1978, and any records related to my grandfather's bridge construction." Betty raised her eyebrows but didn't ask questions. She disappeared into the back room where they kept all the old records. It took about an hour, but she came back with a thick folder full of documents, some of them yellowed with age. David sat at one of the public tables and went through everything carefully. There it was, all laid out in black and white. The property deed showing the exact boundaries of his land. The survey maps clearly indicating that the bridge was entirely on his private property. His grandfather's original building permits from 1978. And most importantly, there was absolutely no recorded easement giving anyone else the legal right to cross his land. He made copies of everything. Then he made copies of the copies. He wanted to be absolutely sure he had all his proof in order. Next stop was a lawyer's office. David didn't have much money for legal fees, but he'd called around and found an attorney named William Chen, who agreed to a free consultation. William's office was small but professional, and the man himself seemed genuinely interested as David explained the situation. William looked through all the documents carefully, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. After about 20 minutes, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Do they know they demolished a structure on your private property without your permission?" "They seem to think they had the right to do it." Said they had permits. Permits from the county don't override private property rights. The county can't just give someone permission to destroy your property. William flipped through more papers. And you're saying there's no formal easement? Nothing recorded. My grandfather let people use it out of kindness, that's all. William smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who just realized another person had made a very expensive mistake. Do you understand what this means? Without an easement, those 30 families have no legal right to cross your property, and they just destroyed the only practical access to their neighborhood. It took a moment for that to fully sink in. David had been so focused on the fact that they'd destroyed his bridge. He hadn't thought through all the implications, so they're basically trapped. Unless they want to take that 40-mile detour around the mountain, yes. They've landlocked themselves. William tapped the papers. I'll take your case. In fact, I'll do it on contingency. This is pretty straightforward. They owe you significant damages, and they're going to need an easement agreement if they ever want convenient access to their homes again. That evening, there was a scheduled HOA meeting at Meadowbrook. David had never been invited to one before, but tonight he decided to show up. William came with him, carrying a leather briefcase full of documents. The meeting was in the neighborhood clubhouse, a fancy building with a stone fireplace and leather furniture. About 20 residents were there, all looking pretty pleased with themselves. Robert was at the front going through some financial reports. When Robert saw David walk in, his expression hardened. This is a private meeting for residents only. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say, David replied calmly. He walked to the front of the room and set the folder down on the table. William stood beside him. The room went quiet. People were looking at each other, confused about why David and some lawyer were crashing their meeting. David opened the folder and pulled out the property deed. This is my property deed. As you can see, it clearly shows the boundaries of my land. He laid out the survey map next to it. This is the original survey from 1978, and this, he placed another document on top, is the building permit my grandfather got when he built that bridge you just demolished? Robert's face was starting to lose some of its color. What's your point? My point is that bridge was entirely on my private property. You had no legal right to demolish it. One of the residents, a woman in expensive workout clothes, spoke up. But it was a public safety hazard. We had permits. William stepped forward. Permits from the county to address a safety concern don't give anyone the right to destroy private property without the owner's consent. What happened yesterday was, legally speaking, destruction of private property. That's ridiculous, Robert said, but his voice had lost its confidence. The bridge connected to the public road. A bridge on private property, William corrected. Let me explain something else to you all. I've reviewed the property records very carefully. There is no recorded easement giving any of you the legal right to cross Mr. David's property. Your neighborhood was developed with the assumption that you could use that bridge, but that was never formalized. You could have heard a pin drop. Several people pulled out their phones, probably looking up what an easement was. David let that sink in for a moment before continuing. That bridge was the only practical way to reach your neighborhood. The other route is 40 miles around the mountain. Without that bridge and without a legal right to cross my property, you're all going to have some very long commutes. A man in the back stood up, his face red. You can't do this. You can't just block access to our homes. I'm not blocking anything, David said calmly. You destroyed my bridge, and now you're finding out that you never had the legal right to use it in the first place. My grandfather let people use it out of kindness. I continued that tradition, but neither of us ever gave you a permanent legal right. Robert was looking through some papers now, frantically searching for something. Our developer assured us that access was secured. It was in our purchase agreements. Your issue is with your developer then, William said, but that doesn't create an easement where none exists. The legal reality is simple. You need Mr. David's permission to cross his property, and right now, he's not inclined to give it. A younger woman near the front, who David recognized as someone who'd always been polite when they passed each other, raised her hand tentatively. What do you want? How do we fix this? That was a fair question. David had thought a lot about this. First, I want compensation for my destroyed bridge. It was valued at around $150,000. Second, I want a formal recorded easement agreement with very clear terms. And third, I want an apology from the people who made this happen. The room erupted. People were shouting, some at David, some at each other, some at Robert. One man was yelling that they should sue. Another woman was saying they should just pay whatever David wanted. Someone else was demanding to know how Robert had let this happen. Robert tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was chaos. Finally, he shouted over everyone, "We're not paying you anything. We'll sue you and we'll win." David gathered up his papers. "You're welcome to try. My lawyer will be happy to handle that case. In the meantime, I suggest you all get used to that mountain detour. It's going to be a long winter." As David and William walked out, they could hear the argument continuing behind them. People were angry, scared, and confused. Good. Let them feel what it was like to have your life turned upside down by someone else's arrogance. Over the next few days, the reality of the situation set in for the Meadowbrook residents. That mountain detour wasn't just inconvenient. It was a nightmare. What used to be a 10-minute drive to work or school now took nearly 2 hours. The roads were narrow, winding, and dangerous, especially in bad weather. Parents were showing up late to work because they had to drop kids at school via the long route. One family missed a flight from the airport because they'd underestimated how long the drive would take. Emergency services issued a statement saying they'd respond to Meadowbrook calls, but residents should be aware that response times would be significantly longer. The local news picked up the story. A reporter came to interview David at his property, and he explained calmly what had happened. He showed the reporter the spot where the bridge used to stand and the documents proving it was his property. "I asked them for help maintaining it for years," he told the camera. "They said it was my responsibility. So I guess now they're learning what happens when you don't respect other people's property." The story went viral online. People were divided. Some thought David was being petty and should just let them rebuild. Others pointed out that the HOA had literally destroyed his property and now had the nerve to act like victims. The comment sections were brutal, and not everyone was on David's side. But enough people understood that he had every legal right to do what he was doing. Inside Meadowbrook, the community was tearing itself apart. Robert and a few other residents were firmly in the "don't negotiate with him" camp. They'd hired lawyers to find some way around this. They were looking into claims of adverse possession, implied easements, necessity doctrines, anything that might force David to give them access. But another group was forming, led by a retired teacher named Helen, who lived near the entrance of the neighborhood. She was telling anyone who'd listen that they needed to negotiate, apologize, and make this right. "We did this to ourselves," she told people. "Robert demolished that man's bridge without even checking who owned it. We treated him like a nuisance for years. Now we're paying the price." The neighborhood was split right down the middle, and that division was only going to get worse before it got better. 2 weeks into the detour situation, and Meadowbrook was falling apart. David heard about it from the news, from social media, and from the occasional resident who'd show up at his door. The mountain route wasn't just inconvenient anymore. It was destroying people's lives. The school district sent out a notice that they might have to discontinue bus service to Meadowbrook. The route was too long, used too much fuel, and took the bus away from other neighborhoods for too long. Parents would have to figure out their own transportation. That announcement alone caused 3 families to start packing. One morning, David was having coffee on his porch when a couple in their 70s pulled up in an old sedan. The man got out slowly, using a cane, and his wife helped him walk up to the porch. David recognized them vaguely as Meadowbrook residents, but he'd never spoken to them before. "Mr. David," the old man said, "I'm George, and this is my wife Linda. We live on Maple Street in Meadowbrook. What can I do for you?" Linda's eyes were red like she'd been crying. "We wanted to apologize. We never voted for what Robert did. We didn't even know he was planning to tear down your bridge until it was already happening." George nodded. "We're not here to ask you for anything. We just wanted you to know that not everyone in that neighborhood treated you badly. Some of us appreciated that bridge and the fact that you maintained it all these years." Something in David's chest loosened a little. "I appreciate you saying that." "My wife had a health scare last week," George continued. "Heart palpitations. The ambulance took 45 minutes to get to us because of that damn detour. In the old days, they'd have been there in 7 minutes. His voice cracked. "We're selling our house, taking whatever we can get. We can't live somewhere that emergency services can't reach." After they left, David sat on that porch for a long time, thinking. He hadn't considered how this was affecting people like George and Linda. People who'd had nothing to do with Robert's decision. people who were just trying to live their lives. But then he'd get other visitors, and his sympathy would evaporate. Robert showed up one evening with 2 other board members, all of them, in business suits like they were coming from a corporate meeting. They didn't ask to come in. They just stood at the edge of David's property and made their demands. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000 for an easement," Robert announced. "That's more than fair." David almost laughed. "50,000? Your HOA member literally just told me people were selling $500,000 houses. You think I'm going to give you permanent access for $50,000? You're being unreasonable. The courts will force you to grant access eventually. This is a necessity situation." "Then let the courts decide. My lawyer says that's not how it works, but you're welcome to spend your money finding out." One of the other board members, a woman in a sharp pantsuit, stepped forward. "You're destroying people's lives over pride. Is that really who you are?" David felt his anger rising. "Who am I? I'm the guy who maintained that bridge for 15 years without asking for a dime. I'm the guy who came to you asking for help and got treated like garbage. I'm the guy whose property you destroyed. So yeah, maybe I am that guy now. You made me that guy." They left without another word, and David could hear them arguing as they walked back to their car. He knew they were going to keep fighting this legally. Fine. Let them spend their money on lawyers who'd tell them the same thing William was telling him. They didn't have a case. The harassment got worse after that. Someone threw a rock through David's window at 2 in the morning. He found his mailbox smashed with a baseball bat. Nasty notes appeared on his door. "You're destroying families. Hope you're proud of yourself. Karma is coming for you." David installed security cameras. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him into giving up what was rightfully his. But the worst part was the division in the community at large. The local Facebook groups were vicious. People who'd never met David, who knew nothing about the situation except what they'd read in headlines, were calling him every name in the book. Greedy, heartless, a monster. Some said he was holding families hostage. Others said he should be arrested. On the flip side, just as many people defended him. They pointed out that the HOA had destroyed his property and refused to help him for years. They noted that he had every legal right to do what he was doing. Some even said he was being too generous by offering to negotiate at all. The attention was exhausting. David had never wanted to be a public figure. He just wanted to be left alone, on his little piece of land with his grandfather's legacy. Helen, the retired teacher who'd been advocating for negotiation, started coming by regularly. Unlike the others, she didn't come with demands or arguments. She came with genuine conversation. She'd sit on his porch, and they'd talk about everything except the bridge situation. She told him about her 30 years teaching 5th grade. He told her about his grandfather and the stories of building the bridge. One afternoon, she finally brought up the situation. "The neighborhood is destroying itself from the inside. Half the people are ready to pay whatever you're asking. The other half wants to fight you to the death." "What do you think?" David asked. "I think you have every right to be angry. I think Robert was an arrogant fool who created this mess, but I also think there are 28 other families who didn't do anything except live in a neighborhood that happened to be accessible by your bridge." "I know," David admitted. "I think about that. But if I just give in now, what was the point? They destroyed my property and treated me like garbage for years. I'm not saying give in. I'm saying maybe there's a way to get what you deserve while also letting people get on with their lives." David appreciated her honesty. She wasn't trying to manipulate him or make him feel guilty. She was just stating facts. The local media coverage intensified when property values started becoming public knowledge. Houses in Meadowbrook that were listed at $500,000 weren't getting any offers. One family dropped their price to $300,000. Still no buyers. Who wants to buy a house that requires a 2-hour detour to reach civilization? The real estate agents started speaking out. They were losing commissions on these sales. They wanted the situation resolved. Some of them tried to paint David as the villain, but others pointed out that the HOA had created this problem themselves. Then came the moment that really showed how bad things had gotten. A young mother named Ashley, who lived in Meadowbrook with her 2 kids, went on the local news in tears. She explained that her son had asthma and needed to be near a hospital. The detour made that impossible. She was a single mom, couldn't afford to just sell at a loss, and was essentially trapped. David watched that interview, and it gutted him. Her kids didn't ask for any of this. They were just victims of Robert's arrogance and the HOA's refusal to help maintain a bridge years ago. But here's what made David stay firm. The very next day, Robert went on that same news station and said, "This is what happens when one person has too much power over a community. David is proving why we needed to take action on that unsafe bridge." The anchor pushed back. "But it was his property. You destroyed it without permission." "Property rights shouldn't trump community safety and access," Robert responded smoothly. David called William after seeing that. "He's still not getting it. He's still acting like he did the right thing." "Some people will never admit they're wrong," William said. "But the law is clear. We'll win this if we stay firm." Inside Meadowbrook, the split was getting worse. Helen called David one evening, sounding tired. "We had a meeting tonight. It got ugly. Robert's group accused my group of being traitors. Someone threw coffee at the wall. The police had to come break it up." "I'm sorry," David said, and he meant it. "It's not your fault. Robert did this." "But David, you need to know something. His group is talking about more aggressive action. I don't know what that means exactly, but I wanted to warn you." David thanked her and double-checked his security cameras that night. He was starting to wonder if this was all worth it. Not because he was wrong, but because the emotional toll was getting heavy. He'd gone from being a quiet guy living on his grandfather's land to being the center of a community crisis. His phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Lawyers wanted to represent various parties. Random people wanted to tell him he was right or wrong. He started letting everything go to voicemail. One message stood out, though. It was from a woman named Carol who'd lived in Meadowbrook for 8 years. "Mr. David, I just want to say I understand why you're doing this. My husband and I talked about how the HOA treated you, and it wasn't right. We're prepared to pay our share of whatever settlement you reach. Not everyone in this neighborhood is like Robert. Please remember that." That message made David think. Maybe Helen was right. Maybe there was a way to hold the people responsible accountable while not punishing everyone else forever. But he wasn't going to just cave. Whatever happened next, it had to be on terms that respected what had been done to him and his grandfather's legacy. The question was, would the HOA come to their senses before everything collapsed completely? A month into the standoff, and the real consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. David saw it all playing out from his property, and honestly, some of it was hard to watch. This wasn't just about inconvenience anymore. This was about people's entire lives falling apart. 3 families had already moved out, taking massive losses on their homes. One couple sold their house for barely half of what they'd paid for it, just to get out. The buyer was an investor who planned to sit on the property until the access issue was resolved, then flip it for a profit. That made the other residents even angrier because now they knew vultures were circling. The school situation got worse. The district made it official. No more bus service to Meadowbrook starting next month. Parents were scrambling to figure out carpools, but that mountain detour meant leaving the house at 5 in the morning to get kids to school by 8. Some parents quit their jobs because they couldn't manage the schedule. Others were trying to arrange for their kids to stay with relatives in town during the week. David heard all this through the news, through Helen's visits, and through the occasional resident who'd stop by. Some came to plead, some came to apologize. A few came to threaten, though they usually left quickly when they saw the security cameras. The financial pressure on the HOA was mounting too. Their insurance company had denied the claim for legal fees, stating that the deliberate destruction of someone else's property wasn't covered. Robert and the previous board members were now facing personal liability. The HOA's lawyers kept telling them the same thing. They didn't have a case, and continuing to fight was just burning money. William kept David updated on all the legal maneuvering. "They've tried everything. Adverse possession, which doesn't apply because the timeline's wrong and you never gave up ownership. Easement by necessity, which doesn't work because an alternative route exists even if it's inconvenient. They even tried to argue that the bridge was a public structure, But your grandfather's permits and property deeds shut that down immediately. How much are they spending on this? David asked. Easily 6 figures at this point. And they're not going to win. Any lawyer worth their degree is telling them that. But Robert wasn't giving up. David heard through Helen that Robert had borrowed against his own house to keep the legal fight going. The man had turned this into a personal crusade. He couldn't admit he'd made a catastrophic mistake, so he just kept doubling down. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. David was working in his yard when he heard sirens. Multiple sirens getting closer. An ambulance, a fire truck, and 2 police cars went screaming past on the highway, then disappeared around the mountain toward the long route to Meadowbrook. Helen called him 20 minutes later, her voice shaking. There's been an accident. An elderly man, Mr. Peterson, fell down his stairs. The ambulance is taking the long route. David, he's been waiting almost an hour now. David felt sick. Is he going to be okay? I don't know. But his wife is hysterical. People are angry. Really angry. That evening, the news reported that Mr. Peterson had suffered a serious head injury and was in critical condition. The doctor interviewed said that the delay in medical response likely contributed to the severity of the outcome. He might not make it. David couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about Mr. Peterson and his wife, about how a bridge that used to get emergency services there in 7 minutes now couldn't get them there for over an hour. Yes, the HOA had destroyed his bridge. Yes, Robert had been arrogant and dismissive. But was this really worth someone dying? The next morning, David called William. I want to settle this, but I want it done right. You're sure? I'm sure. That man lying in the hospital, that's not what this was supposed to be about. They worked out terms over the next few days. David's demands were firm but fair. First, $150,000 for the destroyed bridge, paid by the HOA and specifically by the board members who'd approved the demolition, not the general residents who'd had nothing to do with it. Second, a formal recorded easement with crystal clear terms. The HOA would maintain any future bridge or road crossing his property, pay for all repairs, and have clear liability for any issues. Third, a public written apology from Robert and the other board members who'd approved the demolition. And fourth, something new David had been thinking about. The HOA would fund a community scholarship in his grandfather's name, $25,000 a year for 10 years, for local kids who couldn't afford college. That last part wasn't about money. It was about making sure his grandfather's legacy was remembered for something positive, not just this mess. William presented the terms at an emergency HOA meeting. David didn't attend, but Helen filled him in afterward. Robert tried to fight it, said the terms were outrageous, but everyone else shut him down. They're tired, David. People are losing everything. They just want this to end. The vote was 27-3 in favor of accepting the terms. Only Robert and his 2 closest allies voted against it, but Robert still wasn't done. He stood up at that meeting and announced he was resigning as president, but would continue to fight this personally. He called the residents cowards for giving in. He actually said that people would have forgotten about Mr. Peterson's accident in a few weeks and they should have held firm. That's when things got really ugly. Helen said that several people started yelling at Robert. One man, Mr. Peterson's son, got right in Robert's face and had to be pulled back by others. The new board president, who they'd elected on the spot after Robert's resignation, told Robert to leave the meeting. When he refused, they called the police to escort him out. It was awful, Helen told David over coffee on his porch. The man has completely lost it. He's convinced he was right and everyone else is wrong. His wife left him, moved in with her sister in another state. She couldn't take it anymore. David almost felt sorry for Robert. Almost. The man had destroyed his bridge, refused to take responsibility, and dragged an entire community through hell because he couldn't admit a mistake. The payment came through 2 weeks later. $150,000 deposited into David's account. It wasn't just from the HOA General Fund. Robert and the 2 board members who'd voted for the demolition had to personally contribute significant amounts as part of the settlement. They'd approved the action, so they bore the responsibility. The written apology came next. It was published in the local newspaper and posted on the HOA website. Robert's signature was on it, though Helen told David he'd fought signing it until his own lawyer told him he'd be in breach of contract if he didn't. The apology acknowledged the wrongful destruction of David's property, admitted they should have verified ownership before taking action, and recognized the years of dismissive treatment David had received. Reading it, David felt something release in his chest. It wasn't everything. Words on paper couldn't undo what had been done. But it was something. An acknowledgement. A record that said he'd been wronged. The scholarship fund was set up through the local community college. The first recipient would be announced next semester. David went to the college to meet with the scholarship committee and shared stories about his grandfather. About how the man had believed in education and helping others. About how he'd built that bridge with his own hands because he believed in making things better for the community. That's what this scholarship should honor, David told them. People who want to build things, who want to help their communities, who believe in hard work and looking out for each other. Planning for the new bridge began immediately. David worked with engineers and the HOA's construction committee. This bridge would be wider, stronger, and built to last. It would have proper lighting, safety rails, and a weight limit that could handle emergency vehicles easily. The design included something David insisted on, a plaque. Not a big flashy thing, just a simple bronze plaque that would be mounted at the entrance. It would read, Chen Family Bridge, originally built 1978 by Joseph Chen, rebuilt 2025. A reminder that respect and community matter. During the construction planning meetings, David met many of the residents he'd only known from a distance. Most of them were genuinely apologetic. They shared stories about how the detour had affected their lives and expressed appreciation that David was allowing the easement to be established. One woman, a single mom with 2 kids, broke down crying when she thanked him. You could have left us like that forever. You had every right to. But you didn't, thank you. Those moments made David feel like maybe this was all worth it. Not for revenge, not to prove a point, but to establish that people couldn't just run over others and expect no consequences. And yet at the end of the day there had to be room for resolution. But not everyone was grateful. A few residents, particularly Robert's close friends, still treated David like the villain. They'd turn away when they saw him, make snide comments within earshot, act like he was the problem. David learned to ignore them. You can't please everyone, and some people will always blame others for their own mistakes. As construction on the new bridge began, David would walk down to the site and watch the workers. The steel beams going up, the concrete being poured, the structure taking shape. It looked different from his grandfather's bridge, more modern and industrial, but it served the same purpose. One evening, Helen came by with news. Mr. Peterson woke up. He's going to make it. Still has a long recovery ahead, but the doctors say he'll be okay. David felt a weight lift off his shoulders he hadn't realized he was carrying. That's good. That's really good. His wife wanted me to tell you something. She said to tell you she doesn't blame you. She blames Robert for creating this situation in the first place. I appreciate that, but I still feel responsible. You shouldn't. You didn't demolish the bridge. You didn't refuse to help maintain it for years. You didn't create this situation. You just refused to roll over when they tried to run you over. Maybe she was right. David was still figuring out how he felt about all of it. 3 months after the settlement, David stood at the entrance of the new bridge and watched the construction crew put the finishing touches on it. The structure was impressive, much more substantial than his grandfather's original. Modern steel beams, reinforced concrete supports, LED lighting along the sides, and those safety rails that met every current code requirement. The project manager, a guy named Tom who'd been professional and respectful throughout the whole process, walked over with a clipboard. We're just about done. Inspector comes tomorrow for the final check, but everything's looking good. This bridge will last 50 years easy, probably longer with proper maintenance. My grandfather's lasted almost that long, David said. Your grandfather knew what he was doing. I looked at the pictures of the original structure. For something built by one man in the 70s, it was solid work. That meant something to David. Having a professional acknowledge what his grandfather had built made him feel like the old man's legacy was being honored, even if the original bridge was gone. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for the following Saturday. The new HOA president, a practical woman named Diane who'd moved to Meadowbrook only 2 years ago and had no involvement in the original mess, had organized everything. She'd invited David to be the guest of honor, to cut the ribbon and say a few words, David had been nervous about it. He wasn't a public speaker, and he knew there'd be people there who still resented him. But Helen convinced him it was important. "This isn't just about you or the bridge," she'd said. "It's about the community healing and moving forward." The morning of the ceremony, David put on his best shirt and drove to the bridge. There were maybe 70 people gathered there, almost the entire neighborhood plus some press and local officials. Someone had set up a small stage with a microphone. Red ribbons were stretched across the bridge entrance. Diane welcomed everyone and gave a brief speech about the importance of community and learning from mistakes. Then she introduced David. The applause was mixed, enthusiastic from some, polite from others, and notably absent from a few people standing in the back. David approached the microphone, his hands a bit shaky. He looked out at all those faces and took a breath. "I'm not great at speeches, so I'll keep this short. This bridge represents a lot of things. It represents my grandfather's hard work and his belief in helping neighbors. It represents the mistakes that can happen when people stop treating each other with respect, and hopefully it represents a way forward." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My grandfather built the original bridge because he believed in connecting people, not dividing them. He would have been heartbroken by everything that happened, but I think he also would have understood that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Even when people call you names and say you're being unreasonable." Some people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. "I'm not going to pretend everything's perfect now. Some of you still think I was wrong to do what I did. That's okay. But I want you to understand something. This wasn't about revenge or money. This was about being treated like my property and my rights mattered. About not being dismissed and walked over just because I didn't have as much money or power as others." He looked directly at the area where he knew Robert's former allies were standing. "We all have to live together in this community. This bridge is a reminder that we're connected whether we like it or not. And when we're connected, we have to treat each other fairly." David picked up the oversized scissors they'd provided for cutting the ribbon. "My grandfather would have been proud of this bridge. Not just the structure, but what it represents. I hope everyone who uses it remembers that." He cut the ribbon, and the applause was stronger this time. Cars started driving across slowly, testing it out. David watched as families walked onto the bridge, kids running ahead while parents called for them to slow down. It was a normal Saturday morning scene, something that should have been possible all along. Helen came up and gave him a hug. "You did good. That speech was perfect. Think it'll make a difference?" "For some people, yes. For others, probably not. But you can't control how others think. You can only control yourself." After the ceremony, several residents came up to shake David's hand and thank him personally. The single mom with asthma kid gave him a tight hug. "We can breathe again," she said, literally and figuratively. But not everyone was celebrating. David noticed Robert standing far back near the tree line watching. The man looked like he'd aged 10 years and 3 months. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. When their eyes met, Robert turned and walked away without a word. David felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness watching him go. Robert had lost everything over this: his position, his marriage, his reputation, probably a significant amount of money. All because he couldn't admit a simple mistake and treat someone else's property with respect. A reporter from the local paper came up and asked for an interview. David agreed, and they walked to a quiet spot near his property line. The reporter asked all the expected questions about the settlement, the new bridge, how he felt about everything. Then she asked something unexpected. "Do you regret how this all played out? If you could go back, would you do anything differently?" David thought about that. "I wish none of it had happened. I wish Robert had checked property records before demolishing the bridge. I wish the HOA had helped with maintenance when I asked years ago. I wish I'd never had to become the center of this controversy." He paused. "But no, I don't regret standing up for myself. Sometimes people need to face consequences for their actions. Otherwise, they'll just keep doing the same things to other people." "What about the residents who got caught in the middle? The ones who had nothing to do with the original decision? I feel for them. I really do. That's why I agreed to settle and allow the easement. But they also benefited for years from a bridge I maintained at my own expense. They were part of a community that dismissed me and treated me like I didn't matter. Sometimes being part of a community means sharing in the consequences when your leaders make bad decisions." The interview was published the next day, and of course people had opinions. The online comments were split as always. Some praised David for standing firm. Others said he should have been more forgiving. A few still called him greedy and heartless. David stopped reading the comments after a while. You can't live your life trying to satisfy strangers on the internet. The scholarship fund was announced 2 weeks later. The first recipient was a young woman named Jessica, who wanted to study civil engineering. She'd grown up in the area, worked 2 part-time jobs, and couldn't afford college without help. At the award ceremony, she gave a speech about wanting to build things that connected communities and improved people's lives. David sat in the audience and thought his grandfather would have loved her. The old man had always believed in giving young people chances to make something of themselves. Life started returning to normal. The residents of Meadowbrook went back to their 10-minute commutes. Emergency services could reach them quickly again. Property values started recovering. 3 families who'd been planning to leave decided to stay. David settled back into his quiet life, though it wasn't quite as quiet as before. People knew who he was now. Sometimes folks would stop their cars on the highway and take pictures of the bridge. A few YouTubers made videos about the whole story. One video went viral with over 2 million views, showing the whole saga from start to finish. Helen kept visiting regularly. They'd become genuine friends through all this. She'd bring coffee or lunch and they'd sit on his porch talking about everything under the sun. She told him about her grandkids, her years teaching, her late husband. He told her about his plans for the property. Maybe building a small workshop to do woodworking like his grandfather used to. One afternoon, about 6 months after the bridge was rebuilt, David noticed a car pull up to his property. A man got out, someone David didn't recognize. He was young, maybe mid-20s, dressed casually. "Can I help you?" David called out. The young man walked over nervously. "Mr. David? My name's Thomas." "I'm Robert's son." David felt his guard go up immediately. "What do you want?" "Just to talk if you have a minute." "I promise I'm not here to cause trouble." David gestured to the porch chairs and they sat down. Thomas looked uncomfortable, like he was struggling with what to say. Finally, he started talking. "I wanted to apologize for my father. I know that's not worth much coming from me, but I needed to say it. What he did was wrong. How he handled everything was wrong. Your father already signed an apology as part of the settlement. I know, but that was legally required. This is personal. My dad ruined his life over this, and he almost ruined a lot of other people's lives too. I'm in law school now, and when I study property law, I can't believe he thought he could just tear down someone's bridge without checking ownership first." David studied the young man. He seemed genuine. "How's your dad doing?" Thomas sighed. "Not great. He moved to another state, working some middle management job. He's bitter, convinced everyone betrayed him. He talks about you like you're a villain in his story." "I figured. But I wanted you to know that some of us understand what really happened. My mom left him because she saw what he was becoming. I barely talk to him anymore. He had a chance to make things right, to admit his mistake and move on, but his pride was more important to him." They talked for a while longer. Thomas asked about David's grandfather and the original bridge. David found himself telling stories he hadn't shared with anyone except Helen. About how Grandpa Joe would bring him to the bridge as a kid, teach him about construction and engineering, explain why each piece mattered.